Alrighty, we just broke down all of my picks for the week 0 slate, a ton of really good games, but obviously Florida State Georgia Tech is the one that we're all looking forward to. But also a great fun fact over here, Florida State staying an extra night to do some sightseeing. Maybe that Boston College game just got a little bit more interesting, but we will obviously break that down once it gets there. But let's get into segment 3 here, and let's talk about what Paul Feinbaum had to say about the Alabama dynasty. He was on, frankly, I cannot remember what he was on, but he was on a TV show and he was talking about Alabama. He was talking about going into this season and Kalen DeBoer and all of the changes going on. And they asked him a very simple question, is the Alabama dynasty still alive? And his answer was fairly simple. He said it was dead before Nick Saban left, and now that he's gone, it definitely is. So it's one of those conversations that I've touched on this a little bit over the last little bit as we've kind of gotten into Bama. They're going to take a step back. And frankly, they were taking a step back regardless of who the head coach was. It could have been, Kalen DeBoer or Nick Saban or Bill Belichick. They were taking a step back. I can promise you that, because there's just too many more variables to add to this conversation, whether it's the 12-team playoff or it's, expansion in conferences. It's doing away with divisions, which gives you some tougher games against Georgia and some of the other teams that you didn't have to face in the past. All of these hurdles were going to get any single coach. Nick Saban is a fantastic coach and has overcome odds every single which way, but at the end of the day, it was going to get tougher. They were going to lose more games every single year, regardless of if Nick Saban was the head coach or not. So I do agree with them. I think the Alabama dynasty is over. I think we are on the other side of it now. It could start right back up with Kalen DeBoer, who knows? But at the end of the day, they haven't won a title in a number of years, and they've been, on the wrong side of history for a little bit. So I do think it's over technically, but at the end of the day, I don't know if anyone's going to be joining them anytime soon. I think Georgia has that obvious opening right now because they've won 2 of the last 3. They're heading into the 12-team playoff. If they win this year, that's 3 of the last 4. You can absolutely call that a dynasty, and frankly, I would too. The question is what happens after that, because you have a 12-team playoff. There's more variables. There's more teams that are going to be at the party every single time, and I think it's one of those things that we kind of get a little bit caught up in all of the we get caught up in all of these specific teams. Alabama, we can always count on them to make all of those plays. Georgia, they're above all doubt. They're always going to make those plays and be in that conversation. And I tend to agree with you. But at the end of the day, you can't add more games to the schedule. You can't add more teams to that party, and you can't add more variables to all of the different things around the game and not expect a lot of these things to become tougher to do. This Georgia team this upcoming year absolutely could win a title and absolutely could win 3 of the last 4 and be looked at as a dynasty and go into 2025 as one of the favorites to win another title. But then it's going to get a lot harder to do that. It's not going to be a layup every single year to just walk in and say, we're going to be in this conversation every single year, no matter what. So that made me kind of wonder, are we just done? And I think to kind of fully understand what I'm saying here is you got to fully understand what Nick Saban did. He won 6 national titles over 14 years at Alabama, and he had 3 losses since 3 losses one time since 2009. That is outright insane. And he didn't do it, doing one style of football the entire time. He adapted with the times as well as anyone. Because at the beginning of it, it was Mark Ingram. It was Trent Richardson. It was running in between the tackles and what they called murder ball down in Tuscaloosa. And they kind of wanted to get back to that last year. And frankly, I think they might just this year. But then you saw Oklahoma. You saw Baylor. You saw West Virginia. A lot of these teams start to spread the ball out, and people started to listen. So there was definitely a change. There was much more passing. You had to push the ball downfield if you wanted to be successful, and we saw a little bit of a lull there for whether it was 14, 15, 16, where it was just a little bit tougher. They were able to ride Derrick Henry to a title in 2015, but at the end of the day, they did have to adjust, and then Tua walked in the door, and then Mac Jones walked into the door, and then Bryce Young walked into the door, and they had no problem adapting. They got elite wide receivers on the outside, and they've become a team that when you are an elite wide receiver, it's hard not to look in Alabama's direction. So it's one of those things that what he did is out of this world. What he did should not have been able to happen. Like physically, it should not have been something that he was able to do because the SEC should have been there should have been more teams that were able to take them down. An LSU team that every year should have been in that conversation a little bit more than they were. Auburn is another team that matchup probably should have been a little bit more even keeled. There was just a guy on the sideline that made everything unfair. That was so dominant, that was so intense, that was so aggressive that he was going to make things incredibly tough for whoever he faced. Even a team like Georgia, who dominated college football over the last couple of years, they didn't dominate Nick Saban. He was 5-1 against them. So he did not necessarily hurt for beating Georgia at the end of the day. So I think when you look at all of this stuff, the hurdles that you have to go over is just absolutely insane. Whether it's the 12-team playoff or conference realignment, or probably the biggest one, which is the NIL has to work 24/7, 365. If you have a lull for 2 weeks in your NIL workings where you're just not putting that much energy into it, you're not recruiting the way that you want to, it's going to crumble. And it crumbles very quickly because there's a number of other teams that are ready to take your spot. There's a number of other teams that are ready to spend a little bit more money than you. And that kind of opens a door where maybe there's the passing of baton just way more often in this sport, where maybe Georgia wins the title this year and they're the best team in the country, but then a team like Tennessee or a team like Auburn or a team like Texas or USC or Ohio State, whoever, takes that baton from them the next year. And then following next year, where maybe we add even more teams to the playoff, you have a totally different team at the top of the mountaintop. And obviously this is something that is a little bit of a double-edged sword in a number of different ways, where when you look at college football over the last 14, 15 years, it has become more popular every single year. And the reason for that, in a lot of ways, whether people like to hear it or not, is Nick Saban in Alabama, because frankly there were a lot of people watching them wanting them to lose, and that was the reality of their Saturday. That was the way that they went about business. It didn't work out for them very often, obviously, but at the end of the day, it was one of those things that brought in a lot of viewership. And you wonder if one year it's Georgia, and then one year it's Michigan, and then one year it's Texas, and one year it's USC, would that be a little bit harder for those casual fans, those fans that don't necessarily tune in at all times of the year for college football content? Would that kind of take them out of it just a little bit because it's too much to keep track of? You know, it's always the argument I hear, we always know who's going to win the title, we always know who's going to be in the conversation. Maybe it would flip to, there's too many teams to keep track of, there's too many teams in the conversation. But at the end of the day, that's kind of the big disconnect between a lot of people, where people will say college football is getting worse. People will say college football is suffering. And then someone across the room that doesn't really watch college football will say, well, the viewership numbers are going up. That has to be the moniker for how well your sport is doing. It is not. The best thing about the sport is the parity. The best thing about the sport is the uncertainty, and it's definitely something that I see developing more and more as we get deeper and deeper into this NIL era. I mean, we just saw a 5-star offensive lineman commit to Georgia Tech. That doesn't happen 3 or 4 years ago, and NIL played a big role in that recruitment, and that's a good thing. It's a good thing that Georgia Tech can pull in some of these guys that used to just not even look in their direction, not even pick up the phone when they called. Now they'll listen, and that's a big-time deal, not only for those kids because they get a little bit of money that, frankly, they should have been getting for quite some time, but also you have more teams that are going to have to thread a little bit of a needle. It's going to be really, really interesting to watch, but overall, I mean, we talk about that Alabama dynasty, and it was insane. It was truly out of this world, and I think it became so mundane. It became such a part of the culture and the fabric of college football that we didn't really question how incredible it was. We didn't really question how insane it was because they just kept doing it like it was nothing. But the reality is, pulling off what Nick Saban pulled off is absolutely insane in a BCS or 4-team playoff. In a 12-team playoff, it might just be downright impossible. So I guess when I'm talking about these dynasties, and you know, we have so many incredible ones to look back on throughout the history of college football, whether you want to talk about USC in the 2000s or Bama in the 2010s, you can go back to Miami, you can go back to Nebraska for a number of decades there. But at the end of the day, it's one of those things that maybe with all the changes to the postseason, maybe with all the changes to NIL and the transfer portal and all of that stuff that is making it just a little bit more level around the playing field, maybe that creates a world where dynasties are just a thing of the past. Frankly, I would not mind that one bit. I know there are some people that would not necessarily love that because people love to kind of hate on that big time team, but at the end of the day, it would be an incredible sport to watch if every single season you were going in thinking there are about 16 teams that can win it and someone else is going to lift the trophy than lifted it a year ago. So I think it's one of those things that's going to be really, really awesome to watch. And maybe those dynasties that we've become a little bit accustomed to, Alabama passing it off to Georgia or passing it off to Clemson for a little bit there. Maybe that's a thing of the past. Maybe it's just you pass it every single year and it keeps bouncing around, which I'm firmly in favor of, but I understand there would be some people, especially Alabama fans, that would not be too happy about that. But let's move on. Let's take our third break here. And when we come back, we're going to break down some of the lingering questions for the top 25 teams. We're starting to wrap this up. We're getting towards the end of the top 25, but we're going to dip in a little bit past the top 25 tomorrow. But definitely check that out tomorrow. But let's get into some lingering questions right after this, so stick with us.